Well, moving on, the community service organizations have decried the increasing dependence on donor funds at UNCTAD, the body mandated to articulate policy requirements of East of Africa's structural economic transformation and thus work in support of their realization. This is according to the CSOs, and the fact that the more these organizations continue to donate towards UNCTAD, then at the same rate will its mandate face attrition because of receiving donor aid. Now, to articulate these and much, much more, we are joined in studio by a gentleman from Tax Justice Africa. His name is Cephas Makunik, and he's here to basically tell us a bit about the statement that they wanted included in the communique that will be part of the outcome of this conference. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes, and just to be quite clear, the fact that UNCTAD continues to receive aid, and mostly because a lot of African nations and others are not essentially able to meet their obligations to this body, what does it mean for its role and mandate?
Yes, I think we have been battling a lot in the past years about inclusivity in the global stage, where we find developing countries continuously being excluded from decisions which are made at the global stage. An example is decisions on the international tax system, where rules are apparently made mainly by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the G20. But then, as we see the UNCTAD maybe continuously relying more on donor funding, it means the inclusivity which we envisage might continue to be difficult to be met.
A lot of conversation in the recent past has been about a trade, not aid. And the fact that a global body such as this, which is supposed to articulate the, so to say, economic position of the global south, continuing to depend on aid from the very bodies and countries and organizations that we in the global south tend to feel is leading to attrition of the mandate. What essentially does this mean? Do you think, they sort of get compromised?
Yeah, of course there's a compromise, because once you depend on someone in anything, you obviously have to also fulfill what that someone requires of you. So you become more like you are also dependent on what that someone needs you to do. But then we still feel, as the Civil Society Forum, the Civil Society Forum is made up of stakeholders from the global civil society organizations. So we sat and deliberated from the 15th to the 17th of this month to come up with a statement of what we are expecting to be the role of the UNCTAD in the next 4 years. But then we still feel that the UNCTAD has been doing a very big role in terms of articulating issues for developing countries. Although we still also feel that there is also another hidden hand from the so-called rich and powerful nations to remove certain roles of the UNCTAD, which might work against what we are also looking for. But then we have been pushing, and we will keep pushing, so that at least the UNCTAD is not deprived of the roles which we think will actually be able to push forward the interests of the developing countries.
Let us delve for 1 minute into the text itself, just for viewers to get a feeling of exactly what you think it is that should be included. Maybe you can take us there through that.
Okay. In terms of the taxation issues, what I can quickly talk about is the global financial architecture. As you are aware, or as many may be aware, the global financial architecture is actually having so many weaknesses, as evidenced by the events which happened early this year. If you recall, there was this issue of Panama Papers, where some papers were leaked, which revealed that there were so many huge amounts of finances which were being moved from different parts of the world, and mostly parts of the developing world, to Panama. And these finances are more part of the illicit financial flows, which we always talk about as the Tax Justice Network Africa and our other stakeholders, to say these funds which are moving to the secrecy jurisdictions are funds which are not being accounted. And in our view, we feel that our countries, the developing countries, are actually being deprived of potential tax revenue through those illicit financial flows which are going to the secret jurisdictions. So we feel that the Panama Papers revealed the deep-seated weaknesses in the global financial system.
And just to cut you off right there, because when you think about jurisdictions such as Panama, there are so many others that are close or in one way or another either offer services of, well, zero to no tax. Others offer the secrecy that we're talking about. Some of these are African nations, and the fact that we seem to be appealing to their sort of morality, there doesn't seem to be any sort of big stick that we can build to enforce the things that we're talking about. What then should be the way forward?
Yes, under our statement, under the Civil Society Forum statement on global financial architecture, we're actually calling for an enhanced role of the UNCTAD on the financing for development, as envisaged in the action agenda, the financing for development, third financing for development action agenda, which was done in Addis, where we are saying the UNCTAD should play a more critical role in terms of financing for development, and also we're leading in the definition, defining illicit financial flows, and also leading in the discussions around pushing for country-by-country reporting. Because we feel that as long as transparency is included in the discussion on illicit financial flows, it will go a long way in trying to expose the hidden movement of finances from across the world.
Yeah, staying with financial flows and the issue of taxation, usually part of the problem is the fact that for a lot of African countries, they have little or no capacity to police these flows, especially when they're undertaken by large multinationals, which have global consulting houses on tax and other issues at their disposal. How then do we build this capacity so that when you talk about enforcement, then government and indeed, for example, institutions like the Kenya Revenue Authority would then be able to police this in its jurisdiction?
Yes, that's a very good statement which you make. But then in our view, the issue of capacity building has been raised a lot by many organizations, international organizations. But we feel, in as much as it is important, we also feel that the capacity could be there. But then the will for countries to really come up to support the country-by-country reporting or the transparency in the international tax system, and also the making of the rules. Because what is mainly happening is that the rules which are currently in operation are actually very weak and are actually promoting those illicit financial flows. Because some of the transactions which are being done by multinational companies are not entirely illegal. Most of them actually are actually legal.
It's tax planning, not avoidance.
Yes, it's actually most of tax planning and not avoidance. Of course, avoidance is playing a big role as well. But then, in fact, not avoidance as such, but tax evasion. Yes, avoidance is happening a lot, but it is being actually enabled by the weak tax system. So we are saying currently the global international tax rules are being made mainly by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and the G20. And then we feel that our absence, the developing countries' absence on the table to make those rules is actually exacerbating the problems. So we feel that the contribution by a system, for example, under the UNCTAD, where it will include most of the countries in the world, will help actually address this sort of a situation. Yeah, because we are calling for the country-by-country reporting, but then the issue is also that the developing countries are also not on the table where the international tax rules are being made. So it keeps the interests of the developing countries under a serious problem. Yes.
If you think about it, there's a continued issue of the signing between countries, first of information sharing agreements, then there's the issue of double taxation agreements at a different level. How is this exacerbating or helping resolve this issue? Because when you have the double taxation agreements, sometimes those are taken advantage of. When you then have information sharing, this might go some way towards resolving this situation.
Yes, you are very right. The African Tax Administration Forum, we are working in conjunction with them. They're actually leading the discussion on the African continent on the issue of having African governments actually being part of the exchange of information, the process, and also creating of a model double tax agreement, which is more like very good for the developing countries, mostly likely the African continent, because currently what we are using is the OECD model, and even the UN model is actually more like a carbon copy of the OECD model. In my view, it is inherently skewed towards the interests of the developed countries. And the multinational companies are actually benefiting from that. So we need an African-driven agreements, and we also need African countries to participate in our own issue models as well as even the exchange of information. If African countries do subscribe to it, it will help us achieving the goal which we want to achieve.
So do those Africa-centric models of the agreements exist currently?
We actually have models which are not yet like they are signed or they are really endorsed.
Yes.
But then we have work being done under the Africa Tax Administration Forum, which we feel it will go a long way to address some of the issues. Because if you look at the double tax agreements, which most of our African countries have signed, from the studies which we did in the sub-Saharan Africa, they show that there are a lot of leakages which are arising from that through either treaty shopping and other issues like countries signing lopsided agreements which take away their taxing rights. So we feel that something needs to be done from an African position to come up with a model which is actually to the good of the African continent.
Taxation is just one of the articles on that text that you want included. What are the others?
The other issues which we resolved were to do with the actual underpinning role of the UNCTAD conference, of which we feel that the UNCTAD has been doing a very good role in terms of analyzing the compatibility of different policies like the debt policies, trade policies, tax policies, and other macroeconomic policies, of which we feel that if that is not done, we risk, if that is not checked, we risk not attaining the Sustainable Development Goals or the Agenda 2030. And then the other point which we raised is to do with the better and fairer trading, multilateral trading system. Because as the Civil Society Forum, what we are saying is to say the developing countries need to be given policy space for them to strike a balance between the multilateral trading regulations as well as their own domestic economic issues. So currently we see that the African continent and other developing countries have got limited policy space for them to be able to also look at their own domestic situations, because the current multilateral system is such that it concentrates a lot on trade liberalization and increasing trade flows, whilst it actually appears to neglect the issue that African countries have to also strike a balance on actually addressing their own domestic economic issues. So what we are saying on that is to say African countries should also be given a policy space for them to be able to also look at their own domestic issues. And then the playing field should not be level, because countries are at different developing stages. So those following development at a lesser developed level should be given more space for them to be able to strike. And then
let's just unpack that first, because I think there are several issues in that. First, there's the fact that of the total trade that gets done within and without Africa, intra-Africa trade tends to be just between 10 and 13%, depending on who you ask. So how do we grow that in the first place? And secondly, when you look at Africa and trade between Africa and other parts of the world, for example, with Europe, there's the issue of the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a very topical issue in a place like Kenya right now within the EAC. So how do we then sort of balance out these issues?
This is a very interesting situation, especially if you talk about the EPAs, because in our own view, the EPAs are skewed mainly to the advantage of the European countries. Why I'm saying so is that they concentrate more on trade liberalization. But then the whole issue is to say the goods from the developed countries are supposed to then be allowed to come freely into our developing countries, but then at the expense of our countries. Because what we are saying is that if you would want to take, to do the same, to reciprocate, to say you want to take goods from Africa to Europe, for example, there are certain standards and also other duties which can be actually extended to those products, as long as they are manufactured, for example. So it only favors raw exportation from Africa of raw products and not any manufactured products. So from my view, it is mainly to the disadvantage of developing countries, as I see it. Of course, there are certain benefits which are inscribed in it, but then the issue of a concentration of trade liberalization, to me, is not to the advantage of developing countries, because there are other issues, which domestic issues, which they also have to take care of.
When you again look at the sort of assertiveness that is coming out of Africa finally, the fact that we've had so much said about the different aspects of trade within and without Africa, and Africa saying that as part of the global south. We've seen China make it become a sort of the world's second largest, or depending on who you ask, largest economy. What are the things that we need to get right within our situation to be able to say that we are then beginning to achieve that?
I think it is also important for us to look at value addition, for example. So one of the things which we are calling for as the Civil Society Forum is to do with structural transformation, global structural transformation, and mainly to do with the African continent. What we are saying is it is important for our countries to actually value add on the products so that at least we fetch better prices in the international community. And we also are also looking at investments in the agricultural sector and rural economy as well, so that at least we have better production capabilities of our economies for them to be able to then join the global value chains. But then we are also actually advocating more for development of local and even regional global value chains first, and then so that we can then be able to compete competitively into the global value chains.
Okay.
Yes.
A very interesting sentiments right there. The fact that Africa stands to be able to move forward on its own terms, not at the behest of other parts of the world. It's an interesting conversation. We want to continue that conversation, of course, not just here, but also at the conference itself, where my colleague Abe Agina has been standing by to bring us the perspective from the conference itself. The fact that as the conversation continues, there are different perspectives to that conversation, and that we are able to sample those and bring them to you. Abby, if you can hear me, essentially what is coming out of the conference today, what are the various people, especially the people who have exhibitions there, having various stalls to bring out various perspectives, say?